Marcus Thompson stood in the marble-floored entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel, wearing his only suit, a 15-year-old jacket that was too tight in the shoulders and pants that were slightly too short, with his 7-year-old daughter Lily clutching his hand in her thrift store dress that he'd spent an hour ironing to make presentable. And he felt every eye in the glittering charity gala turn toward them, heard the ripple of laughter from the formally dressed crowd, saw the security guard step forward as if to escort them out. But before Marcus could explain that they had an invitation, before he could show the precious card that Lily had been so excited about, before he could defend their right to be there, the evening's host, renowned philanthropist and billionaire Victoria Sterling, elegant in a designer gown, worth more than Marcus made in a year, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face and ran toward them, dropped to her knees in front of Lily, and said in a voice breaking with emotion, "You came, oh sweetheart, you actually came. I wasn't sure you'd remember me or want to see me again, but you came." And she gathered Lily into a hug, while the entire ballroom fell into confused silence. And Marcus felt his own eyes filling with tears, because he knew exactly why Victoria Sterling was crying, knew exactly what his daughter meant to this wealthy, powerful woman, knew that the story of how they'd arrived at this moment would challenge every assumption these laughing, judging people had made about the single father in an ill-fitting suit and his daughter in a second-hand dress. 6 months earlier, Marcus had been working his second shift as a janitor at Sterling Medical Center, the state-of-the-art children's hospital that Victoria Sterling had founded in memory of her late husband, and Marcus had been mopping the 4th-floor hallway at 11 p.m., tired from his day job at a warehouse and looking forward to getting home too. Lily, who was staying with their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, when he heard crying coming from one of the family waiting rooms, and he found a woman sitting alone in the dark, still wearing an evening gown from some charity event, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and Marcus, who'd been taught by his late wife to never walk past someone in pain, had quietly entered and said, "Ma'am, I don't mean to intrude, but can I get you anything? A glass of water, someone to call." And the woman had looked up, and even in the dim light Marcus had recognized Victoria Sterling from the hospital's donor wall, from news articles, from the photographs in the lobby, and she'd said in a voice raw from crying, "My son is dying. He's 8 years old, and he's dying. And I've built this entire hospital. I've donated hundreds of millions of dollars. I've brought in the best doctors in the world. And none of it matters because I can't save him. Because all my money and power and influence can't stop cancer from taking my baby. And I don't know what to do. I don't know how to accept this. I don't know how to be strong for him when I'm falling apart inside." Marcus had stood there, this janitor, in his maintenance uniform, and he'd thought about his own wife, Sarah, who'd died from cancer 3 years ago, thought about the helplessness he'd felt watching her fade, thought about the rage and grief and desperate bargaining with God that hadn't changed anything, and he'd said something he'd never said to anyone before. Said, "My wife died of cancer when our daughter was 4, and I understand what you're feeling. I understand the fury and the powerlessness and the way it feels like the universe is cruel and random and unfair, and I can't tell you it gets easier or that you'll find peace or any of the platitudes people say, but I can tell you that your son needs you to be present with him. Not strong necessarily, but present. He needs to know it's okay to be scared. He needs permission to talk about dying if that's what he needs. He needs to see that you love him enough to sit with him in the hardest moments, instead of pretending everything will be fine. And Mrs. Sterling, I know you're doing everything money can do, but what your son needs most doesn't cost anything. He needs his mother to be real with him, to cry with him if necessary, to let him see that his life matters enough to grieve." And Victoria had stared at him with something like wonder. And she'd asked, "How do you do it? How do you keep going after losing your wife? How do you raise your daughter alone? How do you survive?" And Marcus had said, "You survive by showing up, by getting up every day, even when you don't want to, by finding small moments of joy, even in the grief, by letting your child see that life can be hard and beautiful simultaneously, by being honest about your pain while also making room for hope. And Mrs. Sterling, your son may die. I'm not going to give you false hope, but he hasn't died yet. And every moment you have with him is precious, is worth being fully present for, is worth showing up to even when it's unbearable, because the regrets that haunt you aren't the times you cried or admitted you were scared. The regrets are the times you weren't present, the times you let fear or denial or the need to be strong prevent you from really being with your child. And I promise you, whether your son survives or not, you'll never regret the moments you were truly present with him. Victoria had wept harder then, but they were different tears. Not tears of desperate isolation, but tears of someone who'd been given permission to be human, to be broken, to be real. And she'd said, "What's your name?" And Marcus had told her, and she'd asked about Lily, about how Marcus was managing to work 2 jobs and raise a daughter alone, about what his life was like. And Marcus had found himself talking to this billionaire philanthropist like she was just another person, sharing his struggles and his small victories, talking about Lily's love of reading and her dream of becoming a veterinarian, talking about the careful budget that meant Marcus could pay rent but not much else, talking about the guilt of not being able to give Lily the kind of life Sarah would have wanted for her. And Victoria had listened with genuine interest, had asked real questions, and when Marcus finally had to get back to work, she'd said, "Thank you, Marcus. You've given me something no doctor or therapist or friend could give. You've given me perspective from someone who survived what I'm terrified of, and I want you to know that if you ever need anything, anything at all, you come find me. You're not just the janitor who happened to be kind. You're someone who changed my perspective when I desperately needed it." Over the following months, Marcus would occasionally see Victoria in the hospital, and she'd always stop to talk, would ask about Lily, would update him on her son Andrew's condition, the experimental treatment that was showing promise. The good days and bad days, the way she was trying to be present, the way Marcus had suggested Dan Andrew's condition gradually improved, gradually stabilized, gradually moved from terminal to treatable to cautiously hopeful. And throughout it all, Victoria maintained her connection with Marcus. And then one day she'd asked if she could meet Lily, and Marcus had been hesitant, had worried about his daughter getting attached to someone from a completely different world. But Victoria had been gentle and sincere, and when she'd met Lily at the hospital cafeteria during Marcus's break, something magical had happened. Lily and Andrew, who was finally well enough to leave his room occasionally, had connected immediately, had started talking about books and animals and dreams, and Victoria had watched her son laugh for the first time in months, had seen life return to his eyes, and she'd looked at Marcus with gratitude that transcended words. Andrew and Lily had formed an unlikely friendship, with Andrew's mother bringing him to the hospital cafeteria during Marcus's breaks so the kids could talk, with Victoria and Marcus gradually building their own friendship, with boundaries being crossed, not through wealth or charity, but through genuine human connection. And Victoria had told Marcus one day, "You saved my son's life, not medically, but emotionally. You gave me the wisdom to be present with him, to be real with him, to let him see my fear and my love." And that changed everything. It changed how he faced his treatment, how we faced it together. And Marcus, I'll never forget that you're the person who gave me that gift. You're the janitor who had more wisdom than all my highly paid advisors, and I want to find a way to thank you. But Marcus had shaken his head and said, "You don't owe me anything. I just shared what I learned from losing Sarah. I just tried to help another parent who was suffering. And honestly, Mrs. Sterling, seeing Andrew healthy and seeing Lily have a friend who understands loss because he faced it too, that's all the thanks I need." But Victoria had persisted, had quietly done things that Marcus only discovered later, had anonymously paid off his medical debt from Sarah's treatment, had created a scholarship fund that Lily would qualify for, had arranged for raises in both Marcus's jobs through channels that couldn't be traced back to her, had respected his pride while finding ways to ease his burden. And when Andrew had his final scan showing complete remission, Victoria had thrown a celebration at the hospital for the medical team, and she'd specifically invited Marcus and Lily. And Lily had worn her best dress and had been so proud to celebrate her friend's recovery. And Victoria had pulled Marcus aside and said, "I'm having a charity gala next month, the annual Sterling Foundation event, and I know it's not your scene. I know you'd probably be uncomfortable, but Andrew really wants Lily to come. He wants her to see him ring the ceremonial bell that we do for children who've completed cancer treatment. And I'm asking you to please consider bringing her. Please let her be part of Andrew's celebration. And Marcus, I want you to know that you'd be there not as my employee or as someone I'm helping, but as my friend, as the person who changed my life when I needed it most." And Marcus had been torn, had known that showing up to a fancy gala would expose Lily to a world they could never be part of, would make their poverty visible, would invite judgment and pity. But he'd also seen Lily's face when Andrew had asked her to come, had seen how much it meant to her to support her friend, and he'd said yes, had agreed, despite his misgivings, had scraped together enough money to dry clean his old suit and buy Lily a dress from the thrift store. And he'd told himself that people's judgment didn't matter, that being there for Andrew and for Lily mattered more than pride or shame or the discomfort of not fitting in. And so they'd arrived at the gala, Marcus and Lily, conspicuously underdressed among the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. And the laughter had started almost immediately, the whispered comments about the janitor crashing the party, the assumptions that they'd come to the wrong place, the security guard stepping forward, the looks of amusement and disdain from people who saw their clothes and made instant judgments about their worth. And Marcus had felt Lily's hand tighten in his, had seen her uncertainty, had been about to turn around and leave to spare her the humiliation. But then Victoria had come running, had pushed through the crowd of judgmental wealthy people, had embraced Lily. And now she stood and faced the crowd of shocked donors and society figures, and she said in a voice that carried through the entire ballroom, "I want everyone here to meet my dear friend Marcus Thompson and his daughter Lily, and I want to explain something important, something that will put into perspective what this evening is really about. 6 months ago, when my son Andrew was dying, when I had lost all hope, when my wealth and status and power couldn't save him, a janitor working the night shift at my hospital found me crying in a waiting room, and instead of walking past, instead of pretending not to see, Marcus stopped and talked to me, and he shared wisdom that came from his own terrible loss. He told me how to be present with my dying son, how to love him through the fear instead of hiding from it. And that conversation, that kindness from a man who had every reason to be bitter about his own loss, but instead chose to help a stranger, that changed everything. It changed how I approached Andrew's final months. Except they weren't final months. Andrew survived. Andrew is in remission, and I believe that's partly because Marcus taught me how to really be there for my son, how to fight alongside him instead of just throwing money at doctors and hoping for the best." Victoria's voice broke with emotion, and she continued, "Marcus works 2 jobs to support his daughter. He cleans my hospital at night and works in a warehouse during the day, and he does this with grace and dignity. He shows up for Lily the way he told me to show up for Andrew. And when Andrew was well enough to leave his room, when he met Lily during one of Marcus's breaks, my son found a friend who understood loss because she'd lost her mother to the same disease that was trying to take him. And their friendship, this beautiful connection between 2 children who'd faced death too young, it gave Andrew a reason to fight that went beyond just surviving. It gave him joy and hope and normalcy. And tonight, when Andrew rings the bell to celebrate his remission, Lily is going to be standing beside him, because she's not just some random guest who happened to show up. She's the daughter of the man who saved my son's life in the way that mattered most. And she's Andrew's friend, and she's here because she was invited. Because she belongs here. Because she matters. And everyone in this room who laughed when they walked in. Everyone who made assumptions based on a suit that doesn't fit and a dress from a thrift store. You should be ashamed. Because you just revealed that despite all your wealth and education and supposed sophistication, you haven't learned the most basic lesson that human worth has nothing to do with money or status or designer labels, and that sometimes the people who have the least materially have the most to teach us about what actually matters. The ballroom was silent now, the wealthy donors and society figures looking uncomfortable and chastened. And Victoria turned to Marcus and said, "I'm sorry." They laughed. "I'm sorry you and Lily had to experience that, but I'm grateful you came anyway. I'm grateful you're here to see Andrew ring his bell. And Marcus, I want you to know that you're not just welcome here. You're honored here. You're celebrated here. Because this entire foundation exists to help sick children. And you reminded me that helping sick children isn't just about medical equipment and research funding. It's about being present, about really seeing them, about loving them through their fear. And that's what you taught me. That's the gift you gave me and Andrew, and it's worth more than all the money everyone in this room donated combined." Andrew appeared then, a healthy 8-year-old boy with bright eyes and a huge smile, and he ran to Lily and hugged her and said, "You came. Mom said you might come, but I wasn't sure. And Lily, I'm so glad you're here, because I want you to ring the bell with me. I want us to do it together, because you helped me get through everything. Talking to you made me feel normal, made me feel like I wasn't just the sick kid. Made me remember that life was bigger than cancer. So will you ring the bell with me?" And Lily looked up at Marcus with questioning eyes, and Marcus nodded through his tears. And the two children walked hand in hand to where the ceremonial bell hung. The bell that cancer patients rang when they completed treatment, and they rang it together. And the sound echoed through the ballroom, and everyone applauded. And Victoria stood beside Marcus and said quietly, "I want to offer you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no, out of pride. I want to offer you a position as Director of Patient Family Services at the hospital. It's a real job, with real responsibilities, not charity. You'd be helping families navigate the emotional journey of having a sick child, using your experience and your wisdom to support them the way you supported me, and it pays enough that you wouldn't need 2 jobs anymore. Enough that you'd have time to actually be with Lily and Marcus. I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because you're uniquely qualified. Because you have wisdom that can't be taught in graduate schools. Because you understand both grief and hope in ways that make you perfect for this role. So please, please, consider it. Not as accepting charity, but as accepting an opportunity to use your pain for purpose. To help other families the way you helped mine." Marcus felt overwhelmed, felt like his entire life was shifting, felt like the universe that had taken Sarah was somehow also trying to give something back. And he said, "I don't have a degree, I don't have formal training. I'm just a janitor who lost his wife and learned some hard lessons." And Victoria smiled and said, "You're not just anything, Marcus. You're a father who turned tragedy into wisdom. You're a person who stopped to help a stranger when you had every excuse not to. You're someone my son loves and trusts, and you're exactly what grieving families need. So what do you say? Will you accept this position? Will you let your experience become your expertise? Will you let me give you this opportunity that you've more than earned?" The following months brought changes that Marcus struggled to process. Struggled to believe were real. He started the new position and discovered he was genuinely good at it. That families responded to his honesty and his lived experience. That he could help them in ways the therapists and social workers couldn't, because he'd walked the path they were walking. He moved Lily into a small house instead of their cramped apartment. He had time to actually be present. For her school events and bedtime stories, and all the parenting moments he'd been too exhausted to fully engage with before. He built genuine friendships with Victoria and Andrew, relationships based not on charity or gratitude, but on mutual respect and affection. And he watched Lily flourish, watched her friendship with Andrew deepen, watched her confidence grow as she realized that she was valued for who she was, rather than pitied for what she'd lost. One evening, about a year after the gala, Marcus sat with Victoria in the hospital cafeteria during his break. He still took breaks there out of habit, still found comfort in the familiar space and, she said, "You know, Marcus, when you found me crying in that waiting room, I was ready to give up. I was ready to accept that wealth and power couldn't save Andrew. I was ready to surrender to grief before he'd even died. And you gave me something I'd lost. You gave me hope. Not hope that he'd survive necessarily, but hope that I could be enough for him, regardless of the outcome. Hope that presence and love mattered even if medicine failed. And that hope changed everything. It changed how I parented, how I faced each day, how I measured success. And I just want you to know that the job I gave you, the opportunities I've created, they're not charity. They're not even adequate thanks. They're just small ways of acknowledging that you changed my life and my son's life in ways I can never fully repay." And Marcus said, "You don't owe me anything, Victoria. I did what anyone should do. I saw someone hurting and I tried to help. And honestly, this past year, this job, this stability, it's changed my life too. It's let me be the father I wanted to be, but couldn't afford to be. It's let me turn Sarah's death into something meaningful, into a way to help others. And that's given me peace I didn't know was possible. So, if anything, I should be thanking you for seeing value in my experience, for giving me purpose beyond just surviving." The annual gala came around again, and this time Marcus walked in confidently, wearing a suit that actually fit because Victoria had insisted on taking him shopping. "You're representing my hospital now, Marcus, and I'm not having my director of patient family services wearing a suit from 2008. And Lily wore a beautiful new dress, and they entered the ballroom not as outsiders, but as honored guests. And the people who had laughed the previous year now greeted them warmly, some because they'd been shamed into recognizing their prejudice, others because they'd genuinely learned about Marcus's work and respected it, and a few because they'd been families he'd helped through their own crises and wanted to thank him. And Marcus realized that he'd gone from invisible janitor to valued member of a community, not through wealth or status, but through the authenticity of his experience and his willingness to share it. And during the evening, when Victoria was giving her annual speech about the Foundation's work, she called Marcus up to the stage and said, "Last year I told you about the janitor who changed my life, and many of you were moved by that story, were ashamed of your initial reactions, were inspired to think differently about worth and value. And I want to update you on what's happened since then, Marcus. Thompson is now one of the most valued members of our hospital staff. In his year as Director of Patient Family Services, he's helped over 200 families navigate the crisis of having a critically ill child. He's saved marriages that were crumbling under stress. He's given parents permission to grieve and hope simultaneously. He's created support groups and resource materials and a whole infrastructure for emotional support that complements our medical care. And families consistently tell us that Marcus made the difference between despair and endurance, between isolation and connection, between merely surviving the crisis and actually growing through it. And I want everyone here to understand something important. This program, this position, this resource for families, it exists because I was willing to listen to wisdom from an unexpected source. It exists because I valued a janitor's lived experience over credentialed advice that wasn't working. It exists because we created space for a different kind of expertise. And that's what I'm asking all of you to do in your own lives, in your own organizations. Look for wisdom in unexpected places. Value experience over credentials. Listen to people your status-conscious minds tell you to dismiss. Because some of the most valuable insights, Some of the most transformative wisdom comes from people who've lived through hardship rather than studied it, from people who've survived rather than theorized, from people who know pain and loss intimately and have transformed it into compassion and service. And if this organization has taught me anything over the past year, it's that wealth can fund programs, but wisdom makes them work. Money can build hospitals, but humanity makes them healing places. And the measure of our success isn't how much we spend, but how many lives we actually touch, how many families we actually help, how many children, like Andrew, get not just medical care, but emotional support. How many parents get not just treatment options, but hope. Marcus felt tears on his face as he listened to Victoria's words, felt the weight of recognition and responsibility, felt grateful and humbled and somehow at peace with Sarah's death in a way he'd never been before, because her loss had taught him things that were now helping others. Her death had given him perspective that was literally saving families. And he thought about how pain can become either a prison or a path, either something that embitters us or something that deepens our capacity for compassion. And he had chosen the path, had let his grief become wisdom, had let his loss become a bridge to help others, and standing on that stage, receiving applause from people who a year ago had laughed at his cheap suit, Marcus understood that true transformation isn't about external circumstances, isn't about going from janitor to director, or from poverty to comfort. It's about learning that your pain has purpose, that your struggles have value, that your story matters, and that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do, become the source of our strength, become the reason we're uniquely equipped to help others facing similar darkness. And Marcus looked out at that ballroom full of wealthy donors and saw not people to envy or resent, but people to serve, because everyone in that room would face crisis eventually. Everyone would experience loss and fear, and moments when money couldn't solve their problems. And when they did, Marcus would be there, would offer the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd survived, would remind them that presence matters more than presence, that showing up matters more than fixing, that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply witnessing someone's pain without trying to rush them through it, or minimize it, or solve it. Just being present with them in the darkness until light returns. And that lesson, that simple, profound lesson about the power of presence, that was Sarah's legacy. That was what she'd taught Marcus through her death. That was what he'd shared with Victoria in a hospital waiting room. And that was what he'd spend the rest of his life teaching others. Because love isn't about protecting people from pain. It's about staying with them through pain. It's about being present in the hard moments. It's about choosing connection over comfort. And Marcus Thompson, the single dad who'd been laughed at for his cheap suit, the janitor who'd comforted a billionaire, the widower who'd turned grief into grace. He'd learned that lesson the hardest way possible, and now he was sharing it with everyone who needed it. And that transformation from broken to healing, from surviving to thriving, from being someone who'd lost everything to being someone who'd found purpose in loss. That was the real story. That was the miracle. That was what made the laughter at the gala irrelevant. Because people who judge by appearances will always miss what matters, will always overlook the profound in favor of the polished, will always choose status over substance. But Marcus didn't need their approval anymore, didn't need their validation, didn't need anything except the knowledge that his pain had become his purpose, that Sarah's death had meaning beyond tragedy, that Lily was growing up, seeing that value isn't measured in bank accounts, but in impact, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe that takes away also gives back, not in the same form, not as replacement for what was lost, but as opportunity to transform suffering into service, to alchemize grief into grace, to become living proof that it's never about what happens to you, but always about what you do with what happens to you. And Marcus chose to use his loss to help others, chose to honor Sarah by being present with families the way he wished someone had been present with them. Chose to teach Lily that hardship doesn't define you, but your response to hardship does. And watching his daughter ring that bell with Andrew. Watching Victoria advocate for a new model of patient care, based on presence and wisdom, rather than just protocols. Watching families he'd helped move from despair to hope, Marcus understood that this life, this unexpected, beautiful, complicated life that had emerged from tragedy, this was worth everything, worth the cheap suit and the laughter and the years of struggle. Because it meant something, because it mattered, because he mattered not for what he had, but for who he'd become and who he was helping others become. And that's the only kind of wealth that actually counts. The only kind of success that actually lasts. The only kind of legacy that actually matters. And standing on that stage at the gala, applauded by people who finally saw him, Marcus felt rich beyond measure, not in money, but in meaning, not in possessions, but in purpose, not in status, but in the simple, profound knowledge that he'd turned his worst loss into his greatest contribution, and that Sarah, wherever she was, would be proud, and Lily, standing beside Victoria and Andrew, would grow up knowing that her father had faced the worst and become better, had been knocked down and gotten up, had lost everything and found what mattered, and that lesson, that living example of resilience and transformation and choosing love over bitterness, that was the inheritance Marcus was leaving his daughter, and it was worth more than any trust fund, more than any social status, more than anything the laughing people in their designer clothes could ever offer, because it was real, it was earned. It was the kind of wealth that comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you give away. Not from what you possess, but from who you become, when everything is taken from you, and you choose to keep growing anyway, keep loving anyway, keep showing up anyway, and that choice, that daily choice to transform pain into purpose, that's what made Marcus Thompson wealthy beyond measure. That's what silenced the laughter. That's what earned Victoria Sterling's tears, and Andrew's love, and the gratitude of 200 families who'd been helped through their darkest hours. And that's what would echo forward through generations, through the lives he touched and the families he helped and the daughter he raised to know that worth comes from character, not circumstance, from kindness, not credentials, from presence, not presence, from who you are when tested, not who you are when comfortable. And Marcus, the single dad in the cheap suit who'd been laughed at and had become celebrated, who'd been dismissed and had become valued, who'd been broken and had become healing. He stood on that stage and understood that the journey from the laughter to this moment had been necessary, had been transformative, had been the path he'd needed to walk to become who he was meant to be. And he was grateful. Grateful for the pain that taught him, grateful for the loss that deepened him, grateful for the struggle that strengthened him, grateful for Victoria who saw value in unexpected places, grateful for Andrew and Lily whose friendship transcended circumstances, grateful for every family he'd helped and every person who'd helped him, grateful for the cheap suit that had revealed prejudice, grateful even for the laughter, because it had proven how wrong people can be when they judge by appearances, and most of all, grateful for Sarah, for the love they'd shared, and the wisdom her death had taught him, and the daughter they'd created who carried the best of both of them forward into a future bright with possibility. And that gratitude, that ability to be grateful, even for the hard things, because of what they'd taught him, that was the final transformation, that was the real miracle. That was the proof that Marcus Thompson had truly learned what mattered, and that everyone who'd laughed at the single dad in the cheap suit had missed the most important story of their lives, had overlooked the hero in their midst, had proven that wealth without wisdom is poverty, status without substance is emptiness, and that the people who matter most are often the ones we're most likely to overlook if we measure value in dollars rather than character, in appearances rather than actions, in credentials rather than compassion. And that lesson, that beautiful, necessary, humbling lesson, that was what Marcus Thompson, former janitor, current director, forever father, gave to everyone who had eyes to see and hearts to understand.